Hey, welcome everybody to Religion Zero number 50.
50?
50? Woo! It's the
Good
word
job
of the day.
to us.
Look at that. We made it through, you know.
Yes. I mean, 2 casualties of war, but we made it.
Surely, slowly but surely. Something
Slowly
like
but
that.
surely wins the race. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think that's a phrase. We'll go with it. We're Religion 050. We're talking about to rebel or not to rebel. But before we get into that, Brooke, how was your weekend? How was your week?
It was all right. It was we've eased some of the restrictions out here in Wales. So from tomorrow, we actually allow indoor drinks and food and all these other great things. So you can meet up to, I think, 6 people from 6 households, whatever our draconian dictator, deems that we're allowed to do. I'm going to be front and center at one of the pubs nearby pretty early on, meeting a couple of friends. So that's going to be exciting. Yesterday, I spent some time out in Cardiff. I did some shopping. I was there with a couple of friends of mine. Did kind of a pub crawl. It's not the same because you have to book a table when you're doing the pub crawl, and they're only giving it to you for like an hour and a half, so you can't like just sit there and enjoy the sun and you can't do that kind of thing. So like the first place we went to, right, had 2 drinks and then it was time to go. Second place, same thing. You had to book the spot. We probably could have stayed longer, and then we couldn't get in anywhere else. So eventually we just bought some stuff from the local grocery and we parked up on a bench and just, got blitted for the rest of the night. So if I'm a little slow today, it is because I am hungover. But apart from that, looking forward to today's show, man. And, how have things been going with you?
Ooh, boy, it's been a week of lots of coughing and sinus infection and headache.
No, it's been not the Rona.
No, thankfully not. Well, actually, if come to think of it, I kind of wish it was so I could just get it over with. You know what I mean?
That's my attitude, yeah.
But and so for my work, I was off Monday just because that was the worst day for sure. And then since then, it's just been teetering off, but not very fast. I'm still feeling most of it, throat coffee, coughing up everything in my lungs. But I went to work Tuesday, Wednesday. And I'm like, man, I got a lot of crap to do. I just need to tough it out. And then come Thursday morning, Call Thursday morning, they're like, hey, are you still sick? And I'm like, yeah, but it is what it is. They're like, no, you should go home and get tested just to be safe because we don't want you walking around spreading it. And I'm like, you don't got to tell me twice and tell me to go home against my will, right?
Yeah.
I'm fine not working for the rest of the week. So I got my test, took like 2 or 3 days because I did like the CVS generic mass population one. So they didn't get me results till yesterday, but it's negative, which is what I expected. But now I'm kind of wishing a little bit it was positive because my work thing is like you get to work from home for 2 weeks if you test positive. I'm like, that'd be sick.
That's not bad.
I don't have to bankrupt myself on paid time off for being normal sick. But I guess I do.
Yeah. There's a scheme out here in Wales as well. I think if you're below the poverty line kind of thing and you test positive, they give you like £500, for the 14 days, which isn't bad. It's that's pretty good. Kind of wish I fell into that category, but I'm just like you. I think I've had the virus, and we have the killer Vindaloo that's coming out here. So basically the Indian variant, and everybody's freaking out about that and stuff. No evidence it's any more deadly. It's it's kind of just more spreads easier, what we expect. So yeah, I'm my attitude is like I just want to get it. Like let me just get it over with, get the immunity, and get on with my life. So I totally understand that attitude.
Yeah. I've been wanting it too because I'm definitely not a high risk guy, right? I'm relatively young, and even though I'm a big dude, I've never had high blood pressure, never had diabetes, I have no conditions, right? I'm just a big dude, just been born big. So just the way it is. Dude, when I was in 6th grade, I was 200 pounds.
Wow. How tall were you at 6th grade?
5'11".
Jesus. Dang, man.
Yeah, I grew up like freaking Goliath. Yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I didn't hit my full like 6'3", almost 6'4" until I was like a freshman in college. So I was still growing that whole time.
That's amazing.
I was about 260 all throughout high school. It was pretty nuts. Made football really easy. Made football.
Yeah. That's awesome, man.
Yeah. But I do have one more announcement on why we didn't do a show last week.
Yes. Fill in the good people, our fans.
I got this. Whoa, no, wrong one.
Oh, beautiful. Look at that. It's a picture of us.
Whoa.
Yeah. It's us streaming.
Inception. This.
There we go. Oh,
Boom.
she's a beauty, man.
Yeah, that's my delayed birthday gift to myself.
Yes. What did
I
you call
bought
it?
I haven't thought of one yet.
Vernon.
Nothing. Vernon. An old man name. But yeah, I bought it a couple weeks ago, but I had to buy it like, 2 hours away, over 100 miles away, because that bike was the only one in my town was brand spanking new. And I'm like, I don't want a new bike, that's way too much liability. Yes. So I was trying to get a used version just because I have long ass legs. Like the pegs and seat is so spread out that I can actually like put my legs up like a normal person. And all the other ones, I felt like I was in the fetal position or like a bear on a tricycle, But yeah, got that mailed to me Monday on my sick day, so that was kind of awkward. But yeah, got that. And then Sunday I had to go do the driver's test for it. So now I am officially sponsored.
License.
I'm legally allowed to drive it now, so that's cool. Wink, wink,
Excellent.
nudge, nudge to any of the police, watching.
Don't stop me, please. Well, congratulations, man. It's a beautiful bike. So hopefully we'll get a couple more pictures on your Facebook and elsewhere, that we can enjoy, and maybe some road trip photographs as well. That'd be pretty cool.
Oh yeah, you'll probably also see some of me in a ditch and upside down and my eyeball hanging out, because I'm not good at it, but I can do it.
I mean, just lightly on that, I actually passed my theory test for the driving license out here again. So yeah, maybe pretty soon I'll be on the road as well. I just have to do the practical in a couple of days, or weeks, whenever they schedule me. So yeah, I think we're both almost road legal, so that's great.
We're almost doing things. Take that, society.
Awesome.
All right. Well, today's topic is to rebel or not to rebel. And I was just thinking of this is because I know we talked about it before with some of our past guests and past panelists about like how involved should Christians get into politics. But this is more about like when is the politics so much like you need to do something about it, right?
Right.
Where is your limit between it's stupid, whatever, just ignore it, and just maybe minor inconveniences, versus like the government's doing something actually wrong, right? So I just wanted to tip that out, talk about what's the Christian's role in dealing with that, because most people always quote verses, and we'll probably get into that, like the Romans 13 and 1 Peter. It says, just be subject to all authorities, God put them there. But there's also other verses that talk about, what to do when you're having conflict with others or with institutions. And historically, we definitely did not follow that as well. So
Correct.
Just talking about, the history of rebellion, and what should we take from verses and what should we take from history, and how can we apply that to today if you think something is so bad that we have to do something about it, and what would that be, right?
Yeah.
Brooke, I don't know if you want to take it first. Where were you thinking of when going into this topic?
Yeah, that's kind of what I looked at. And for the first 300 years of the church has basically been persecuted, from the various sects and so forth. But I think I don't know if it's God's wisdom or what, but at some point it actually flipped, and the church actually started taking more political positions to defend people. We had the Crusades, we had standing armies and different sorts of things. And it's not very clear as to what the role of the Christian is supposed to be. As you say, you mentioned like in Romans 13 and elsewhere, it talks about like the soldier doesn't, carry the sword in vain. You should, obey the authorities. The king is appointed by God, and all of these verses about, the structures that are in place. But at the same time, if we allow that just to have free reign, Christians could basically be eradicated off the planet, right? It's, as much as it grows under persecution, if they never took a stand, never took any kind of position, they could technically be wiped out by a much more aggressive force. So I don't believe that, Christianity is non-violent, but I don't necessarily believe it's pacifist.
Mhm.
And there's a distinction in that, and we see it in church history. As I say, some of the great kings, King Harold, for instance, for the Norman invasion in England back in 1066, he prayed in what was at that time Wessex. He got healed of his paralysis and went on to lead the Anglo-Saxon rebellion against the Norman invasion. Joan of Arc, again, she fought against the English for the French. And she kind of had like this warrior vision and so on. George Washington apparently had a miracle when he crossed the Delaware, and it was all about divine providence in the founding of America. 6-Day War with the nation of Israel. Ridiculous accounts of things that happened at that time. And I say all of that just to point out that it seems that sometimes God actually uses empires for his purposes.
Mhm.
And the ultimate story of that, of course, is the destruction of Jerusalem, where he talks about the beast that was going to come across that had 7 heads, which are the 7 mountains. Yeah, it was Rome, right? It was Rome was sent to be the judgment of God upon Jerusalem, and it crucified the people, and it was a bloodbath.
Mhm.
So God is not completely removed from the political realms of men, and that involves sometimes Christians rising up and actually taking part in some of these things. As for where that line is, I have no fucking idea.
Yeah, Tom put up something funny. It's he crossed the Delaware and then slit throats on Christmas morning. All
Yeah,
in the
I think
name of
that's
the new Christian nation, right?
I think there was something about there was a fog that came over the Delaware River that basically hid the army from the British,
Mhm.
that allowed them to get onto the ships and into the place to do it. Yeah, I think that's the story. Somebody fact check me on that or something like that. But yeah,
Yeah,
pretty cool.
I'm not much of a history buff, so I just know random stuff. But yeah, it's pretty interesting. Like, I think, especially when I think of rebellion, almost one of the first things we think of is the U.S. Rebelling against the British, right? And
Correct.
most relatively, I don't know how you UK guys see it, but in America, that's generally a universal positive. No matter Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, everybody was happy about that, right? It's
Well,
pretty,
except for King George, was it who
yeah.
lost the colonies?
Yeah, but like all Americans on all political spectrums agree, like they're all happy 1776 happened, right?
Sure.
and and like that was a form of rebellion, wasn't it? And even though we had separation of church and state and all that part of stuff, like the founding fathers were still very Christian principled, right?
Yes,
But they were still out there actually killing people. So it's very interesting. Like they clearly didn't read Romans 13, did they?
Well, I mean, to be fair, the founding of America wasn't a religious act in a sense. They were religiously minded, of course, but it really was the founding of a nation. It wasn't necessarily the founding based on the Christian rebellion and the church and other things. But I get your point. They all had Christian ethos, and they took part in the revolution. They was it money, liberty, their fortunes, basically to commit treason, and we're still seeing the effects of that today.
Yeah, and it's just crazy to me to think about that, because like, and you were talking about at the beginning, like juxtaposing that from like the early church, which was like actual oppression, people getting murdered left and right,
Yeah.
and they didn't do some big political revolt. They just, suck it up, chump. This is your life now, right?
I mean,
we're still going to do our Christian stuff, but we're not going to go, fight the Romans.
Exactly. I mean, Nero used to light Christians on fire to light his gardens at night, right? This is one of the Caesars. I think all of the 11 apostles were basically crucified or boiled in oil, or
I believe all except John, right?
Except John. John was the only one who probably died of old age, although there's a sect of people that believe he's still alive on the earth, but that's another story.
Bigfoot.
But yeah, for the first 300 years of the shit, it was persecution by the Romans, by the Jews, by various Gauls and other like pagan groups. The Vikings wreaked havoc, on the Christians before it, kind of Christianized the Scandinavian countries. That's not a winning strategy at the end of the day. I think at some point there has to be a line where you kind of say this far and no further. And as we said, we've seen kind of God's intervention in some respect of that taking place throughout history. Even in the American Civil War, Stonewall Jackson is an amazing story of he was a general for the South, but he was like a man of faith, man, and he believed that he was as safe on the battlefield as he was in his own bedroom. So where people were like cowering and they were like, crawling on the ground to avoid gunfire and musket fire and cannon, he was up on a horse. Right? He was like an easy target, and he didn't give a shit. Like, somebody brought him a message, and a cannon blew up the tree that was right next to him. Jumps off his horse, signs the paper, give it back to the guy, jumps back, completely fearless. He had like the calling of God in his life.
Yeah,
who knows?
Yeah.
That's pretty incredible.
Yeah, thankfully, well, I mean, if that was more in modern times, he could have just like sent a text, right? But
yeah,
you got to do what you got to do, if you don't have email.
I mean, there's a school of thought that said if Stonewall Jackson did not die, the South might have actually won. So if God's plan was to unite the country, he had to eventually take Stonewall Jackson out of the picture, because the guy was just fearless and he never got hurt, or at least to my knowledge, in any of the battles.
Oh yeah, and I mean, this is a little bit of a side point, but wasn't Robert E. Lee like pretty crazy too? Because like I think I read somewhere that like he didn't even care about the Confederacy. He just got like hired to do the job, and like he didn't even like politically agree with the South.
Yeah. It paid, right? So if a lot of people, they jumped onto it because that's where the food was, right? That's where you get the money and the resources and stuff like that. So I've heard that story as well.
Yeah, so it's like the general of the Confederate Army doesn't even care about Confederate politics. He's like, I don't know, it's just a job, I guess.
Exactly.
But yeah, I just think it's very interesting how we juxtapose though, and like this is one of the reasons I wanted to bring it up, and it's like a good introduction. Is like I think the waters of this is very muddy, right? There's a lot of gray areas because especially like I don't know if this happened when you were a kid and in church and stuff, but you always had all those like Karens and stuff. That always talk about like, oh, we need prayer in schools and we need to rebel against that. But I mean, the early church like was like actively dying, and they didn't say anything like that. They're like, we're just going to do what we do. And if we die, we die. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's very interesting. And like, especially of how volatile current politics is. And, it's very tribalistic. It's very, everyone's at each other's throats, at least verbally. There's still some violence, you see, riots and stuff, but for the most part, it's a lot of like rhetoric that's vehemently like, oh, we're going to secede. Oh, we're going to beat you. No, we're going to beat you because our politics are different. And you have Christians on both sides, on every spectrum, all saying this is the Christian right way to do it. We're rebelling against you. And it's like, no, you're in power. We're rebelling against you. Right. And so there's a lot of rebellion, revolution talk on really every side of the spectrum, because in this little front, but like, the politics are way more complicated than just left guys versus right guys, right?
Correct.
Like all of their shades all also agree and disagree with each other, and there's a lot of infighting in general. So it's not really left versus right. It's like these 10 different shades of left and these 10 different shades of right all fighting the other 9 shades as well, right?
Correct.
There's a lot more than just those. And then there you go. You get the libertarians. It's like, we're a party. Come on, guys. Remember this. And they usually infight a lot too. Amos, feel free to comment, your experience
when you review the
video. But yeah, so I don't know. I kind of just go through like the pros and cons, the arguments for and the arguments against rebellion. I think the cons against rebellion is literally like 2 specific scriptures, right?
Right.
The big one is Romans 13. I put in like 1 through 7.
Right.
It talks about a little bit more before and after, but it's kind of the root things. And it says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and that those exist have been instituted by gods. And then he goes in, that's the first verse, and he goes into talking about, God put them there, so it's your job to pay taxes and do all those things because God put them there, right?
Yes.
Which is interesting because it wasn't the sole reason, but a big reason of the American Revolution was taxes, right?
Yes.
That was one of the big points of letter.
Taxation without representation, and
yeah, and their taxes were significantly less than what we currently have, right?
I think so. It wasn't as high as this, so probably not. I think when the income tax was originally introduced, it was supposed to go no higher than 2%, but governments never turn off the spigot when it gets the money, so that never happens.
Yeah, and I think that's also one of the pros for rebellion. Talking about that is because a government, is an institution that's still about self-preservation at the end of the day.
Correct.
Any companies, corporations, and governments, none of them are trying to make themselves out of a job. They're always going to want to be needed and always want just a couple more resources and just a couple more resources and a couple more branches and a couple more products, right? The goal of a business is not to go out of business, right? And the goal of a government is to not need a government, even though philosophically you could probably argue that, but literally it's a self-growth process, right? Self-preservation. So they eventually are going to cross a line, right? As government grows and, gets its tendrils out more and more, it's eventually going to have to cross a line. And so that means, I think, unless we're all like, Brave New World drugged out, and being happy with the authoritarian government, eventually there's going to be some kind of revolution, rebellion, flip, right?
I mean, that's what we've seen throughout history. Every civilization, every form of government leans towards totalitarianism in one way or another. We get these cycles, we get, the period of peace, and then that's usually followed by some kind of dictatorial sort of thing, where the society collapses, then some tyrant raises to power. And, it's just a continuous cycle. And even democracies, which is why no democracy or republic has lasted more than 800 years. Eventually, and I'd say we're seeing this in the UK as well, they just start making a whole bunch of shitty laws that like nitpick every little detail of your life, and it becomes such a burden on the society. It basically crushes the economic engine and lifeblood of society.
Mm-hmm.
That's been the cycle for at least 3,000 years, right? Since we've had kind of modern civilization. So
wait, mate, you got a license.
Yeah. Wait, mate, you got a license for that license. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Hey, that's an unregistered butter knife.
Yeah. It's they call it anarcho tyranny. So they can't actually fix the big problems in the country. So we have a lot of grooming gangs, we have drugs, we have gang violence that they keep very quiet. And because, the population is not armed, these people who don't care about the law, they kind of have a free reign. But they're not going to fix that problem. Instead, they go tyranny on the small things like, telling jokes on the internet and, having the wrong opinion and all these other things. So they crack down on all the little things while at the same time, the big things go unaddressed. And that's kind of the state of the UK. And it's coming.
It's the worst of both worlds.
Yeah, it's coming. I mean, you guys have a constitution, so it's a little easier for you guys, but keep your eyes open, man.
I don't know. We've had some, especially last year, we've had a couple politicians saying like, it's not my job to deal with the Bill of Rights. I'm just doing my job. Right. That happened a couple times last year with some politicians. So, and medical experts.
Yeah.
We'll just leave it at that.
I mean, where would the line be though? I mean, I don't think there's any clear, there's nothing in scripture that kind of says when this crosses the line. Mm-hmm. There's nothing in history that really says when this crosses the line. Because sometimes, Joan of Arc, of course, is peasant girl, gets a vision, rebel against the English, I don't know if that's some kind of method. Like how do you measure that, right? But I mean, for you personally, what would be the line for you?
So this is tricky for me because, and I think we talked about it a long time ago of like, where would you be if you weren't a Christian? Because I think the line's been crossed so many times that I think I said like, if I wasn't a Christian and this wasn't like a muddy area, I would probably already be a domestic terrorist. Like I probably would have already been on quite a few lists and maybe arrested. But yeah, I think a lot of it's pretty bad, right? And so this is something I have to talk about and think about in my head and chew on all the time is like, I have all of these inclinations to go do stuff, to try to save things, but is it my job now as a Christian to do that or not? And I think this is worthwhile of talking. I was going to bring up a quote that I think is interesting. It's from Francis Schaeffer. And he said, if government cannot be criticized or disobeyed, then it is trying to take the place of the living God. That government has become a false God. Christ must be the final authority and not society and not Caesar.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well said.
And so if that's a very interesting way, I think, to look at it, as like the pros for rebellion is a good starting point. Is talking about if your authority cannot be criticized or disobeyed, then it's essentially creating its own God, right?
Correct.
God is the only thing that's infallible, so to speak, right? So if your government is trying to be infallible, those by default are grounds for rebellion, right? Because it is now essentially a false idol. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I like what I don't know if there's necessarily grounds for it from a religious standpoint, definitely from a political standpoint, because that's basically tyranny, right? They are authoritarian and they're basically, you know, encroaching, you know, upon your personal liberties and stuff like that. In terms of a religious side to that, because again, that's what the church took. They took it up the ass for like 300 years.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they just basically got the shit beat out of them. So I don't know if there is a line that the church would recognize. And the church has been on many sides, sometimes the wrong side of many conflicts in the history of humanity since, you know, the founding of the church. Honestly, I don't know. But I would agree with you. On a personal level, if the government was encroaching upon my personal liberties, maybe not from a religious standpoint, but just from a, you know, my inner anarchist, like I want to be free motif, I would rebel at that point. And yeah, I would fight for freedom at that. I don't know if it's a religious thing though. That's where the problem comes in.
Yeah. And that, you know, that's why we originally brought up like the American Revolution side, is because they weren't doing it because the church declared it. They were just doing it because they were individual Christians and saw a lot of, you know, oppression, injustice. Yes. Yeah. And they spilled blood for it. Right. And so, I mean, obviously, like if they never did that, it would still suck a lot, right? But it still wouldn't nowhere suck as bad as the early church, right?
Well, hopefully it never gets that bad again. Let's hope and pray.
You don't want to seeing Ben Franklin on a cross for having wrong think. You know what I mean? I mean, it could have gone there, but I don't think it would have for a while at least. You know, because we can never say for sure, but. Because they were rebelling about stuff that's, I think, less of a big deal than what we have today, right? We have significantly more taxes, and it's very easy to argue without representation.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
The government represents whoever pays them, you know, essentially at the end of the day. And that's a whole long rant we can talk about later. But yeah, it's like we have I think we have it way worse than even the American Revolution had it. And I think it's, you know, it goes, American Revolution was pretty bad. We have it slightly worse. And then the early Christians said it the worst, but they were the least rebellious, right? So that's why we're in that weird middle gray area between the two, because the one that wasn't as bad is the one that had all the blood spill, and the one that was the worst had practically none. You know what I mean? There was something, you know, there was some there, not necessarily from Christians, but one of the disciples was it the Zealot, right? Was it Simon the Zealot?
Simon the Zealot, yeah.
Yeah, and the Zealots were Jews that were actively fighting the Romans, right?
Yes, politically they were like a separatist group trying to get like Jerusalem independence.
Yeah, and so he was all like, they called him Simon the Zealot because he was like a political guy, and some of them were actually like assassins, like actually trying to go out and kill a lot of the Roman officials. And,
correct.
Jesus called him one of his bros, right?
Yeah.
You don't really see anywhere in the Bible. He may have, you know, not written down, but it's unlikely because it wasn't in the Bible. They never, you know, told him to repent of that, right? Or encouraged him to do it either, right?
Correct.
It was just like, oh, he's a guy that's just, you know, wants, you know, death to all Roman officials, but, you know, he's cool. He can hang out with us, Simon the Zealot. So yeah, it's a very weird muddied water.
You know, I completely agree. There isn't any clear defining line, although we have seen God intervene in certain conflicts and certain, you know, individuals who have championed, you know, either a rebellion or a crusade or whatever the case might be. So I don't think God could use anything, right? He's big. He's, you know, he's going to use everything. You know, like a good example of that is, yes, okay, when Britain had their empire of like 1/5 of the world, yes, you can talk about the horrors of colonialism, but at the same time, the King James Bible went around the world. Like that was huge for Christianity. The fact that the British Empire who had published the King James Bible, controlling 1/5 of the world's territory, that got the Bible into millions of people's hands, even to this day. Even though the Anglican Church is kind of a defeated, entity at this point, God can bring gold out of anything. And yeah, he's done that with conflicts as well. As I said, the American Revolution is a great story. The French, there's some stuff with the Russians as well. Some of the czars have some very interesting stories. Even the battles between, the Romans, the Latins and the Eastern Church with the Crusades. Yeah, a lot of stuff went on with that. As Tom was pointing out, even the Protestants and the Catholics have had, their fair share in terms of like the Northern Ireland and elsewhere. So yeah. I mean, God, I think we make the choice to act on the rebellion. I think it's completely subjective as to what point that is. But God can use anything, and in that he can, find ways to be glorified and expand, the rule of the kingdom and evangelize and other things.
Yeah. So now that those are muddy things, also we're probably going to take this, for the people watching, we are going to make this a slightly shorter one. Brooke has people he's got to. Are they coming over your place? Or you go over theirs?
They're coming here. So yeah.
So that, and I'm still relatively sick. I'm surprised I haven't coughed my lungs out this far. I've been able to hold it in. But you can also probably hear my nose is definitely congested, messes with my voice. But so probably at like the 45-minute mark, we'll open up to Q&A and probably end around an hour instead of our normal hour and a half. But
yes.
So before we get to that, this is the one thing I think is for sure biblical. And it's both relative to the early church and Christianity, and also was used recently in American history of like the civil rights movement and MLK Jr. And I talked about passive non-compliance, right?
Right.
I think that is something that is a stronghold biblical idea, right?
Yes.
It's what the early church used. It's also what the civil rights used, the sit-ins at diners and all of those types of things. The passive non-compliance is essentially, I'm not going to do what you tell me, but I'm also not going to fight you, right? I'm just going to do my thing peacefully and nicely. And if you want to beat me up for it, okay. Right. And it's a very influential thing, right? Because it's super obvious. And that's one of the things, like when you see all those videos of like those black students going and sitting in a diner and then all those people harassing them and beat them, it's obvious who's the good guy and bad guy in that scenario, right?
Yes.
Super obvious. It's very influential. And it's also very biblically supported. I brought up two verses that talk about this. The first one's in Romans 12, which is right before Romans 13. So that's even
good,
more fun. Yeah.
Chronological order.
It starts in verse 19. It says, "Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink, for by doing so, you will heap burning coals on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good."
Yes.
Right? And everyone's always heard that verse before of, be good to those who do bad, because, it heaps burning coals on their head.
Yes.
And that's something you hear all the time, like as a kid in Bible school, but they never really explain what it means, right? At least in my experience, it was always just one of those Bible verses you memorize and nobody ever told you what the hell it meant, right?
Yes.
And I think that is a perfect example of what the civil rights movement did, right? Is they were being very polite, they were being passive, they weren't trying to fight fire with fire. They were doing polite things, they were acting as respectfully as possible, but they were doing their own thing, right?
Correct.
I think those are very similar. And the heaping coals on the head, people were getting outraged because they were sitting and ordering coffee in a white diner, right?
Yeah, a white
or
diner,
not sitting in the back of the bus, right?
Correct.
They were doing their normal stuff, and everyone else freaked out and considered it an attack for them being polite, normal citizens.
Yeah. I mean, we call it civil disobedience.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's the same premise where you're stepping outside the line as a group, but in some kind of protest and stuff like that. But it's not affecting anybody. It's not violent or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, the examples you raised are fantastic. Even Gandhi, to a certain extent, and the Hindus, when the British Army was in India, Gandhi used a lot of like non-aggressive tactics and so forth as a resistance to the empire. So yeah, that's a very effective method. I'm trying to think. There's something that the Japanese used to do. There was like when they went on strike, they would still do their job. So, if you're a bus driver, for instance, they would still do the job, but they wouldn't charge anybody any fees.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So they're still working, they're still doing all the things they're required to do by law, but they're not charging anybody. So that's another
bleed them out.
That's another example of it.
Yeah. I also think of in the Old Testament, Rack, Shack, and Benny from Veggie Tales, right? They were supposed to worship the was he Babylonian king? I can't remember where he was from.
Yeah. So it was Nebuchadnezzar. Yeah, he was Babylonian. He was the Babylonian exile.
Yeah, and so he had this big statue of himself, and they were ordered to worship it, and they're like, "Nah, we're good." Well, then you'll be burned. And they're like, "Well, that sucks." But we're still not doing it. You know what I mean?
Correct.
And they weren't trying to declare war. They weren't like raising up their own domestic terrorist group. They were just like, "Nah, we're good.
Correct.
We're gonna do our thing, and whatever you do is on you." Right. And then they got thrown into a furnace or a fire or whatever. And then, God saved them from being burned. And then that changed Nebuchadnezzar wigged out, and that whole story. But I mean, that's another similar story of like that passive noncompliance or that civil disobedience is like, yeah, we're not going to do that. That goes against our morals and our religion. But whatever you do is on you. Right. And I
Correct.
think that is out of this whole weird money area. That is the most forward, that's the most solid thing that at least we can establish and start with, right? Completely biblical, completely historical, very effective, right? But
it might get you thrown in the fire, but yes,
there
is that
it's very
side.
effective in getting your message across, though.
Especially
now that we have the internet and camera phones, and right,
yeah, exactly.
Because a big part of it is people seeing people wig out on you doing something normal and non-aggressive.
Correct.
Yeah. There's the other verse that talks about this similarly, and it's more of a indirect reference, but it talks about Peter and Paul getting into an argument, right? This is something I brought up that I thought is more of a prose of rebellion too, because when you're talking about in between brothers, for those that know, Peter started hanging out with the Jewish only guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're like, oh, even the Gentiles, they might be saved, but they need to be circumcised. They still need to follow all the Jewish law. And then Peter started getting in that crowd, and started being with those guys. Paul's like, wow, you're dumb. Right?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. I think that I wrote down what he wrote specifically. He said, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not a Jew, how can you force the Gentiles to live
as Jews?
Live as Jews. Yeah. And so the ability that we can directly confront each other and still disagree, right? I think that still is like an indirect leading to talking about one of the pros of that is that we're still allowed to check people, right?
Correct.
Even though they didn't, go to blows or have a duel, so to speak, right? You were able to confront people, right? If they're wrong.
Correct.
It's not full pacifism, even in a rhetoric sense. So, what do you think about that? Do you think that applies, or what do we get out of that message?
Yeah, no, that's a great one. So, Peter and has kind of come to an understanding of the grace to come. He'd kind of let the Jewish traditions lax. And then the Judaizers who were trying to get the Gentiles circumcised show up, and he puts on an act. He's basically fronting for the Jews, right? And that's where Paul basically lashes out at him. It's ironic because even Paul had a similar circumstance when he met with James on his return to Jerusalem. And James basically said, look at the church, look at all this kind of stuff, look at all the Jews, and they're still zealous for the law. And he convinces Paul to perform a purification ceremony. And this is what people have to realize. The book of James is not written to Christians. He's writing to Jewish believers. And you can see that James never got the full revelation of the thing of grace because he's still talking about the law. So immediately after that confrontation, Paul is basically, they kick him out, and people are like, this is the guy who's saying we don't need to keep the law, don't need to circumcise and stuff, and they kick him out. And he immediately goes and writes the book of Galatians, which basically says we don't need the law, right? So there are these times of conflict between brothers. James never fully got it. The revelation of the new covenant was given to Paul, and that's why Paul was able to correct Peter. Peter was still a minister to the Jews. So there's all of this kind of interworking that's going on. But yeah, to the point that you're making, yes, we are called upon to, challenge each other and correct each other, which is why the First Amendment in the United States is so special, because most of the issues that we're confronted with in society can be dealt with through debate, reason, discussion, and all of these different types of things. I don't think there's ever been a time in history where suppression of speech and conversation has ever resulted in anything good. So that is, by all means, if you have a grievance, you are completely within your right to air it, whether it's, a grievance against state, against your brother, and all of these other things. And if that's not heard, that's where these actions like civil disobedience and other things come into play. And even in the church, if you have a problem with your brother, we have clear instruction. Go and talk to your brother. If he doesn't listen, then go and bring a couple of other brothers with you to try and convince them. And if not, then you kind of bring it before the church and these things. And if they still wouldn't comply, then you make the decision whether they stay in communion with the fellowship or not. So there are guidelines of how to deal with conflict within the church, and a lot of good examples of how we deal with it outside the church.
Mm-hmm. So how can we use that towards the people who are yelling at each other, right? Like, oh, this version of leftism or this version of rightism or this version of this and that is the real Christian way, and y'all are wrong, right? How can we juxtapose that, that issue with what we're going through right now? Is it relevant? Is it not relevant?
It's tough because you can't change somebody's mind who does not want to have their mind changed, right? So this goes back to Jesus and the parable of the sower. The sower went out to sow, and the seed fell on, stony ground, shallow ground, and good ground. And, the stony ground, nothing was produced. The shallow ground was produced, but then the birds of the air came and took it away. And then there's good ground that produced 10, 50, and 100 fold. So the fact is, sometimes there are arguments that you're just not worth having. Mm-hmm. And the problem with, especially in the modern political sense, when it comes to religious arguments, it's so subjective. Mm-hmm. And you're not dealing with a rational position. If a person did not come to a belief through a rational position, you can't reason them out of it. Mm-hmm. So if it was an emotional plea or some kind of whatever, it's usually emotional. They tend to be committed to that, and that choice normally comes with a number of consequences. So just because we have these techniques doesn't mean you're always going to win, which is, it's the fact of life, right? But yeah, it doesn't mean that we don't have to try and speak and be like the sower. Just try and find the good ground and don't waste your time breaking up the hallowed ground and the stony ground where it's not fruitful. As a friend of mine used to say, 1/3 of people are going to like you, 1/3 of people are not going to like you, and 1/3 just don't give a shit. Yeah. And the best that you could hope for is that 1/3 that don't give a shit, you could kind of bring them over to your side. That's like a best case scenario. Maybe, right? But once you're okay with those odds, don't waste your time on futile discussions, focus on what's in matter and look for good ground. I think that's a good way to put it.
Yeah. So if something is futile, also, by the way, I put the link of the StreamYard in the chat. So if you guys want to join, ask a question, comment, share, something like that, feel free to click that. Come on in. That'd be awesome. But what was I saying? I already lost it. So is it still, because you're talking about if it's futile, right?
Yeah.
To me, that's I agree for the most part, but also you can't tell something is futile until you try it, right?
Oh yes, I agree. You don't know if a door is open unless you try it. So I think we've all had the experience. And correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure you've had this experience as well. Somebody asks you a question. So what about what about hell or whatever? What about the Trinity or whatever the case might be? And you pretty much get a sense within a couple lines of that conversation whether they are genuinely asking a question, trying to learn and understand, or if they're just being a pain in the ass and antagonistic, right? And they're trying to do a gotcha.
Yeah.
That's where we need the discernment to kind of know one from the other. I used to get into those arguments all the time. Many of them were from my previous church members that I used to fellowship with. And even though I'd won the argument, they could not refute anything, there was no way in hell they could ever show that they agreed with me, because then they'd be excommunicated from the church, right? So there's all this other baggage that you have to kind of be aware of. And yeah, you just need the wisdom. You need some wisdom when dealing with that.
All right. And saying that, we have a our good friend Tom.
What's up, Tom?
What's happening, Tom?
Hey, we got a echo. I can hear me in you.
We are all
one. I'll fix it real quick.
It's all good.
I think it's the echo count. How's that? Is it better?
Testing
1, 2, 3.
Yeah, it's
Testing.
fine. Yep.
There you go. Good job.
Good to see you guys.
Good to
What's
see
going
you,
on,
Tom.
Hey, look, you're not in a car. That's interesting. Or it's a really big car.
Hey, I stand the car calling. I think it's legit.
Good man.
Okay, so I'll jump into my question. Brooke, you just mentioned like the book of James, that he didn't have the full revelation. And I think Christians would be offended at that. They don't get offended when you say that about the Old Testament. But even Martin Luther called the Epistle of James an epistle of straw, right? Yeah. So I kind of want to get your understanding, because I think today people will preach in the mainstream evangelical church. They'll preach on the book of James, and it'll be like, this is something hard that will like really sock you in the gut, and make you stand up straight. So can you like comment? Is this supposed to be like that, or are we supposed to be focusing on the grace?
The book of James is a very interesting book, and it opens with the apostle of James writing to the tribes scattered throughout Asia. Gentiles don't have tribes. The entire book of James is written to Jews. And there are a lot of things in there, of course, that they take out of context. This is a much bigger subject. I'm not going to be able to cover it all. What I will do is I'll put some links in the description and elsewhere where you can like get some more information. But there's a very famous verse in there that people take completely out of context, which is, you think confessing that, there is only one God, you think you do well. Even the demons believe that, and, and believe there's one God and there's trembled. And they're saying, if you think faith alone will save you, you have to have works. So we know that faith and works work together. And they're taking that entire thing to say that works and faith are required for salvation. Yeah. That has nothing to do with what he's talking about.
Yeah.
What was going on in the time when James wrote the book was the Jews were living in the time of the imperial cult of Rome. The Caesars were God. And part of the Roman Empire, you had to worship the Caesar. So when you read about the book of Revelation, you put the mark on your head and the mark on your hand to buy, sell, right? You go to the agora, which was the marketplace. You burn an incense to the idol of the Caesar, and it gives you access to the marketplace, right? So it's all the cultural stuff. The Jews had an exemption from worshiping the Caesar. The Jews were allowed to confess the Shema, which is, hear, O God, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. So James is saying, when you confess there is one, meaning you confess the Shema to avoid the persecution from Rome, you're not confessing Christ. You are hiding behind your Jewishness to keep yourself from being persecuted. And then he says, look at me. I am the one confessing Christ. When you come to this point, join your brothers, the Gentiles in persecution, and confess Christ. That is the work he's telling them to do. So it has nothing to do with work salvation and all these other things, but it is a massive topic. I'll send you some links. You can dig into it a lot more from there.
Yeah. Because when you said that at first, my first thought in my head is like, yeah, that's gonna make the Sola Scriptura people angry.
It's context. Yeah. It's all context. If you understand who it's written to, why it was written, and what was the circumstances, then it's fine. But when you take that and basically say it applies to us, you're out of step. You're out of step.
And this is something I've talked to someone about actually yesterday, because they were talking about Sola Scriptura, and they were talking about homosexuality is a sin in the Old and New Testament, therefore blah 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 blah. Right.
Right.
But I brought up even Sola Scriptura people don't actually believe Sola Scriptura, because they were quoting 1 Corinthians talking about homosexuality sin. I'm like, well, what about the 1 Corinthians? I think it's chapter 11 that said women need to shave their heads if they're ever dishonored. For praying without long hair, or praying with without their head covered. Exactly. And I'm like, that's in the same Bible, and he calls it just as an abomination as homosexuality. So why aren't we out here shaving people's heads in disgrace? Right? That's in the New Testament. That's in the same letter you just quoted.
Exactly.
Right? And they're like, well, that one needs context, but not these other ones. No, they all need context. There's not Sola Scriptura. You don't even believe Sola Scriptura.
Correct.
Cool, guys. Thank you for your answers. A lot more questions, but I will be respectful of the time. So again, y'all need to drop a Cash App link or something.
Yeah, Conk is working on that.
Yeah, I got my own personal one of Conk 2000 if you just want to give me free money. But,
Okay.
Yeah. Do but don't, but do but don't. You know what I mean? You do but don't, but do. Yabba dabba do. Hey, we got Stephen Green down here. Shout out to Stephen Green.
Hey, Stephen. Yeah,
he's definitely
Scriptura. Go ahead, man.
He's very we've talked about it before. He's definitely thinks Sola Scriptura is silly as well. So that's good. But yeah, thanks for coming on, Tom. Appreciate it. Always good.
Yeah, good to see you, bro. Hey, check on your girlfriend, man. She's been looking for you.
Oh my goodness.
You know what I'm talking about, man.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, man.
Oh yeah, I put the link in the chat so you can look at the series on James that I have there.
All right. Why am I not
Awesome,
booted
man.
yet? I'm in. Boot me. Do it. Boot me.
Here. Get him out.
Get him out of here.
Old Trump quote.
Yeah, it's interesting on the Sola Scriptura thing. Like I remember I was arguing with the Sola Scriptura, and he's like, how why do you know that the Bible is like the word of God and all this other stuff? And he immediately gave a personal testimony of an encounter. Like he basically said God showed him this and that and the other and stuff. So I said, you're going to believe your experience that's not in the Bible, but you saying Sola Scriptura is the only way to understand truth. Right.
Man, kids these days.
Yeah. And this is what I keep saying. Christianity is an experiential religion that they wrote down. So to limit God to that, and even in our conversation today, if all you had was the scripture and you didn't know about Joan of Arc, you didn't know about King Harold, you didn't know about these other events in history, you would not have a full picture of what God might be doing.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool.
All right, we don't have much people lined up, so we can probably start wrapping it up if we want. You got final thoughts first, Brooke?
Final thoughts. I'm still looking for I did a video on the Book of James. I'm going to find that really quick.
Okay.
But I'll send the links to you, and you could put them underneath if anybody wants to get into it. God he has bigger plans for humanity than our attempts at government and all these other things. And yeah, we sometimes have to be listened to some of those subjective experiences when it comes to when to rise up for whatever cause you want to be involved in and stuff like that. Generally, you try to live peacefully until some line is crossed, and that might be subjective to you. And I don't think God has a problem with that. As we've seen, there have been conflicts in the past, and God seems to kind of chose sides, and he's shaping the world in the image that he wants it to be. As I said, a clear example of that, of course, is the destruction of Jerusalem. God used the Roman Empire to bring about judgment upon Jerusalem back in 70 AD. And you read about that in the book of Revelation and how, God is using these different types of things. Even Genghis Khan, one of the great empire, slayers and these other things, that was part of his mantras. Like, if I didn't show up, I'm the wrath of God. And basically I'm here because there's sin in the place. And if there wasn't, I wouldn't be here. Right. So even Genghis Khan kind of understood his role.
And I mean, that follows the story of like the Old Testament, right? Where God allowed Jerusalem to getting conquered over and over again because they were being dumb, right?
Yeah. The Babylonians and he used Nebuchadnezzar, the same one as we talked about, to conquer Jerusalem. And then he did it again with the Roman Empire and so forth. So yeah, God has bigger plans than we can understand.
And it's funny thing. So part of my family is very involved in Mongolian culture.
Brilliant.
I have like
Great
6
food, by
siblings.
the way.
Only one's biologically related, and the rest are all adopted or by legal means. And 2 of my siblings are Mongolian, adopted from Mongolia when they're wee little lads.
Brilliant.
And so we've just kept in touch with Mongolian culture. We know a couple random words and phrases. Baishta machine is we need to go bye-bye in the car. We had to tell the kids that a lot when they were kids. But it's funny. When they visited, I didn't get a chance to go, but the rest of my family went and visited Mongolia a couple times, and they treat Genghis Khan like we treat Abraham Lincoln. It's very interesting. Like they have giant statues and memorials of him everywhere. and all of this stuff. He's like one of the national heroes, even though everyone else thinks he's like the Thanos supervillain, right?
Yeah, he's the bad
Like,
guy.
no, dude, he was, they're Mongolia's like, no, he was a straight Chad.
He was venerated out in Asia. You're quite right.
And they are actually a very masculine, empowered society. They're very pro-masculine.
The Mongols and stuff.
Yeah, and they have their own like mini Olympics, and it has to do with their 3 pillars of manhood, is what they call it. And it's horse racing, archery, and wrestling. Are the 3 big sports, and they have their own mini Olympics. Foreigners can come in and try, but you're all going to get your butt kicked because these guys have been doing it since they were born. Like, even some random normie in Mongolia, it can look like some little whiny teenager, can probably beat the crap out of you. Like, their whole life is dedicated to these sports. So they're pretty crazy. But yeah, I love them. They look very, traditionally Asian. They look more like darker skin, Chinese, looking, but their mentalities are very Russian. You know what I mean?
Yes,
they've got that Russian masculine energy. Yeah,
that's a very good way to put it. They've got that hyper masculinity. And ironically, one of the emperors of China, when they were being invaded by the Mongols, one of the things was the Mongols were really big on eating meat.
Mm-hmm.
And because they did that, they didn't like.
Yeah, and they live in a desert, so vegetables can't even grow anyway.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's all meat and dairy. Yeah,
all meat and dairy. And what would end up happening is, unlike the Chinese or even the Romans, they would go days without eating because they were so satiated. So the Chinese could never find the camp because there were no fires at night, right? So they couldn't tell where these people were coming from. So I just thought it was a funny story.
They have a hot rock cooking method. They actually they put meat in like a metal jar, and they put really hot rocks in there, and they spin it around, and that cooks the meat, so they don't even need fire. It's pretty interesting.
It's amazing. Amazing stuff.
Yeah, they're like barbarians and ninjas at the same time. All right,
good times, man.
All right, let's wrap it up. I think good show, shorter show, but it was a good show. I guess end of the day, rebellion's up to you, I guess. Between you and God.
Between you and God, yeah.
But passive non-compliance is a
good way to start.
Good way to start, because at least we get a lot of scripture and historical support for that. Blessed.
Correct.
All righty.
Awesome. So next week back on my channel.
Yep.
Same time next week.
So subscribe here, like, comment, subscribe, yada yada. Like, comment, subscribe to Brooke. And we'll be at his channel next week. Y'all have a good one.
Thanks for watching, guys.